Montana Territory, January 1883, the wind howled sharp over the snow-swept plains outside Fort Benton, slicing through the timber like a blade through hide. Owen Reddick pulled his coat tighter and urged his horse forward, boots cold in the stirrups, breath fogging thick in the brittle air. He was not looking for anything, not shelter, not company, and sure as hell not trouble. He had made a promise to himself 2 years ago: no more caring, no more getting involved, not after what happened in Cheyenne, not after Clara. But then he saw the broken cart. It sat half buried in the snow, tipped sideways into a shallow gulch off the wagon road. One wheel snapped, horse gone. The wind had near buried it, but the pale canvas top tugged wildly in the wind like a flag of surrender. Owen slowed his horse. He almost rode past it. Almost. Then he heard the sound, a cry, soft, scraping, barely more than wind. But it was enough. He dismounted, boots crunching over the crusted snow. The front of the cart was splintered, the tongue cracked right through. As he stepped around the side, he saw her. She was curled in the back, wrapped in a torn quilt, her face white with cold. Her lips were blue. Hair tangled, cheeks hollow, a line of blood crusted near her temple. She blinked up at him, but there was no fear in her eyes, just a kind of empty, hurting ache. "Help me," she whispered, voice dry as dust. "Please." Owen didn't hesitate. He reached in and lifted her, careful of the bruises on her arms. She was light, too light, and shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He wrapped his coat around her and carried her to his horse. "What's your name?" he asked as he settled her in front of him on the saddle. "Florence," she whispered, barely able to hold her head up. "Florence Pritchard." She passed out before he could ask anything else. His cabin sat 3 miles off the main trail, tucked in a narrow valley between tall pines. It had been his father's before him, and before that, nothing but wild land. Owen had not brought another soul there in 2 years. But that night he carried Florence inside, stoked the fire higher than he ever had, and laid her on his cot. He fed her warm broth by the spoonful when she stirred. She coughed, weak but alive. He stayed close, watching the color slowly return to her face. By morning she could sit up. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice still hoarse. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You almost did." She looked around the cabin. It was plain, rough-hewn walls, a stone hearth, a rough table, and 2 chairs. No sign of a woman, no sign of children. "Why did you stop?" she asked. Owen didn't answer right away. He set down the cup he had been holding. "I told myself I was done caring. Then I heard you cry out." She looked at him like she understood more than he wanted her to. "I was trying to get to Fort Benton," she said. "I had nowhere else to go. My brother left me behind when the cart broke. Took the horse, said he'd come back. He didn't." Owen's jaw tightened. "How long were you out there?" "Almost 2 days, I think." He looked down. "He left you to die." Florence nodded. "I have a daughter," she said suddenly. "Her name's Phoebe. She's 5. I left her with a friend in Helena while I came to find work. I was supposed to send for her." Owen looked at her, really looked at her then. The strength it took to survive that cold, the desperation of a mother trying to build something for her child. He felt something shift in his chest, something he thought was long dead. "I'll help you get her back," he said. Florence blinked, eyes wide. "Why would you do that?" "Because I know what it feels like to lose someone, and I'm not about to let you lose her." Over the next week, Florence healed. Her bruises faded, the color came back to her cheeks, and she began to smile, small at first, shy but real. She helped him fix the broken railing on the porch, peeled potatoes for stew, and once, when the snow let up, walked with him to the ridge to look at the valley below. Owen found himself watching her more than he meant to how she tucked her hair behind her ear, how she leaned into the sunlight like it was something she had not felt in years. "You live out here all alone?" she asked one evening, her voice soft. "I do." She glanced at him. "You ever get lonely?" He hesitated, then said, "Used to. Then I stopped letting myself miss anything." Florence looked down at her hands. "That sounds like a hard way to live." He didn't answer. That night, after she had gone to bed, Owen sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He had built walls around himself, so high no one had come close in years. But somehow, this woman, this mother who had nearly frozen to death in a broken cart, had found a crack in them, and he had let her in. 2 days later, they hitched up his wagon and headed for Helena. Florence sat beside him, bundled in his coat, her eyes bright with hope. "Phoebe has curls like mine," she said. And she's always asking questions about everything. She'll talk your ear off. Owen smiled. I think I can handle that. The road was long, but the snow had melted enough to make it passable. They arrived in Helena by dusk on the third day. Florence's friend, a schoolteacher named Miss Garner, welcomed them with tears in her eyes and a small girl bounding down the steps. Mama! Florence swept Phoebe into her arms, crying as she held her. Owen looked away, the lump in his throat too big to speak around. When Florence turned back to him, her daughter in her arms, she said, Owen, I want to go back with you if you'll have us. He stared at her, heart thudding. I do not want to be alone anymore, she said, and I do not want you to be either. He stepped forward, cupping her cheek with his hand. You are not alone, Florence. Not anymore. And that night, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold above the Montana hills, Owen Reddick, who once vowed never to care again, found his heart beating strong and sure in a way it had not in years, because he had found her, and he was never letting her go. Florence leaned into the wind as the wagon climbed the ridge road back toward Owen's cabin, her daughter asleep against her side beneath a quilt she'd sewn years ago in Kansas, when things had still seemed possible. The girl's curls were damp from sleep, sticking to her temple, but her breathing was even, her little hand wrapped tight around her mother's braid. She'll be warm tonight, Owen said, eyes on the trail ahead. The stove's been fed and the chimney's drawing clean. Florence touched her daughter's hair, voice low. She hasn't slept this hard in weeks. Owen didn't reply, but she saw his hand flex on the reins, the way it always did when something mattered more than he could say. The horses crested the ridge, and the valley opened below, rimmed with tall pine and dusted white again from a fresh squall that had passed through while they were gone. The cabin waited in the hollow, smoke curling from the chimney into a sky the color of pewter. Phoebe stirred when the wagon stopped, blinking against the cold. Owen lifted her gently and carried her inside without a word. Florence followed, every muscle aching from the ride, but her chest full in a way it hadn't been for years. Inside, the warmth hit her like a bomb. The cot had been moved beside the hearth, a second one built from hand-hewn boards, and a feather mattress she didn't remember being there before. A scrap of blue calico had been pieced into a curtain above the small window, and there was a new stack of firewood near the stove, chopped smaller for easier burning. Phoebe crawled under the quilt without protest. It smells like cinnamon, she mumbled. Owen poured water into a basin and set it near the fire. I boiled apples while you were gone, figured it might help the place feel less empty. Florence's throat tightened. She busied herself with unbuttoning her boots. You didn't have to do all this, I know. You did it anyway. He nodded once, then turned to tend the stove. That night, after Phoebe had fallen asleep to the sound of pines snapping in the fire, Florence stepped out onto the porch where Owen stood, arms folded, watching the wind move through the trees. She'll want to stay, Florence said. Owen didn't look over. She should. I should too, she said. But I need to earn. He turned then, something unreadable in his face. There's work enough here if you know how to keep a garden and raise hens. I've the coin to build a coop and spring's coming. I was a seamstress back in Abilene before my husband took sick. I'd mend uniforms, patch sleeves, fix hems for the officers' wives. That's honest work. You could do the same in Benton come summer, ride in once a week. She smiled faintly. You think ahead. I do now. They stood in silence a long time, the moon rising behind the trees, silvering the roof of the cabin and the branches that creaked in the wind. Why did you really stop that day? She asked him. I know you heard me, but that's not all of it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, the week before I'd been up near the Milk River trapping, found a man dead in a ravine, frostbit clean through. Young, couldn't have been more than 20. I left him there, marked the spot with stones. Told myself it wasn't my concern, he exhaled, watching the breath drift. But I saw your cart, and I remembered the way his hand looked, curled like it was still reaching. I couldn't live with doing nothing again. Florence stepped closer, her hand slipping into his. You didn't just do something, you gave me back everything. He held her fingers, rough against hers but steady. I want a life that's quiet, steady. I didn't think I'd ever get it, but now. She looked up at him. Now, I want it with you. Florence's breath caught, but she didn't step back. Say it again, she said. He lifted her hand to his chest where his heart beat strong beneath flannel and wool. "I want a life with you, Florence." She leaned into him, forehead resting against his collarbone. "Then we'll build it together." Inside, the fire burned low, casting soft orange light across the floor. Phoebe stirred once in her sleep, then settled again, her face turned toward the warmth. Outside, under the cold moonlight, Owen wrapped his arms around the woman who had returned with more than a daughter. She had returned with hope. And he, who had once vowed never to care again, found himself opening to a future he never thought he'd want, not alone, never again. The thaw came slow that year, reluctant and patchy, creeping down from the pines in thin rivulets that carved through the packed snow like veins. By mid-March, the garden beds behind the cabin were soft enough to turn. Florence worked them with her sleeves rolled, fingers in the black earth, while Phoebe chased the chickens Owen had bartered for from a trader near Judith Gap. A patched apron hung from Florence's waist, frayed at the corners, borrowed from a box Owen's mother had left behind in the loft. She moved with quiet purpose, wrist sure as she sifted stones from the soil, her braid catching the sunlight each time she leaned forward. Owen watched her from the edge of the shed, oiling the hinges on the door he'd rehung that morning. His shoulder still ached from splitting fence posts the day before, but there was an odd comfort in the pain now, like his body was finally being put to good use. "You always plant early," Florence called toward him. "Used to," he said, setting the oil can aside. "My father said the land listens better when it's still waking up." She glanced up, squinting into the sun. "I like that." He crossed the yard, boots sinking into the thawing ground, and crouched beside her. "You thinking beans or cabbage? Both, and carrots." "Phoebe eats them raw, like candy." He nodded, then glanced at her hand resting on the trowel. "You've got a cut." She looked down. "Stone must have caught me." He reached for her hand, turning it gently. The skin was scraped just below the knuckle, red and shallow. He thumbed a bit of earth from the edge and held it a moment longer than necessary. "You always this calm about blood?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I've seen worse." She studied him, then said, "You don't talk much about what you've seen." "No sense in dragging ghosts into a place that's trying to live," she nodded, "but they still follow you, sometimes." There was a long pause, the wind passing low through the grass. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, I could outrun mine," she said. "Turns out they just wait until your hands are still." He let her hand go. "Then maybe we keep our hands busy." They worked until the light shifted, the air cooling as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Phoebe came running with a feather clutched in her fist, breathless with excitement. "It's blue," she cried. "Like paint." Florence knelt to take it from her. "It's a jay feather, you should press it in a book." "I don't have a book," Phoebe said. Owen stood, brushing off his knees. "You do now." "I've got one inside with pages to spare." Phoebe ran ahead, the feather held aloft like a prize. Florence rose slowly, brushing earth from her palms. "You give her things like it's nothing." "I don't have much," he said. "But what I do's better used than left sitting." They walked back toward the cabin together, the air sharp with pine and the scent of turned soil. Later, after supper, with Phoebe asleep under a quilt sewn from old blouses, Owen sat at the table mending the strap on his saddlebag. Florence was by the hearth, turning the hem of a worn dress she meant to cut down for her daughter. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, not looking up. "I did once, after my brother died." "Where would you have gone?" He set the strap down. "Didn't matter." "Just away." "What kept you?" Snow came early, then the roof started leaking, then the mule got sick, and by spring I'd stopped wondering. She nodded. "I used to dream about Oregon, the coast mostly. I wanted to see the sea." "You still can." She looked over at him. "I'm not restless anymore." He met her gaze. "I'm glad." The candle burned low between them, the flame steady. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the yard. Florence set her sewing aside and crossed the room. She stood beside him, one hand resting on the table's edge. "You were alone so long," she said. "You ever wonder how you managed it?" "I didn't manage it," he said. "I just endured it." Her fingers brushed his. "You're not enduring anymore." He closed his hand around hers. "Neither are you." She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and certain, her lips warm from the fire. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she whispered. You are, he said. You're home. And in the stillness that followed, with the soft tick of the stove and the breath of a sleeping child in the next room, their quiet life began to root. Not through grand promises or declarations, but through work, warmth, and the steady unfolding of something truer than either of them had dared to hope for. By early April, the last of the snow had vanished from the valley floor, leaving behind damp earth and the first pale shoots of green curling through the thawed soil. The hens had settled into their new coop, and Phoebe spent her mornings whispering stories to them that Florence pretended not to hear. The girl had taken to the place as if born to it, her small boots leaving tracks in the soft mud between the porch and the woodshed. Florence stood at the cabin door, her arms crossed loosely as she watched Owen carry lumber from the sled to the side of the house. He moved with the rhythm of someone long familiar with labor, quiet, efficient, deliberate. She hadn't asked what he was building, she trusted him to tell her when it mattered. You're making space, she said once he'd set down the last plank. He wiped his palms on his trousers. Figured we could use another room before winter returns. A place for Phoebe, so she don't have to sleep beside the stove when she's older. Florence stepped down into the yard. You didn't ask. I didn't figure I had to. You don't, she said, and reached for his hand through the early spring chill. But it still means something. He glanced over at her, expression unreadable. You sure you want to stay here long enough to need more space? I do, she said, and meant it with every part of her. That evening, she brought out a tin of flour and began mixing dough for bread. The cabin filled with a smell that hadn't touched its beams in years: yeast, salt, a hint of wood smoke. Phoebe sat at the table, coloring on scraps of paper Owen had brought her from the post office in Benton. Her tongue poked out between her teeth as she worked, focused and quiet. Owen came in near dusk, his shirt damp with sweat, wood shavings stuck to his sleeves. He leaned against the doorframe, watching mother and daughter without saying anything. Phoebe looked up. Do you think bears like bread? Only if it's buttered, Owen said, and Florence laughed, the sound catching her by surprise. That night, while Phoebe slept in the cot near the hearth, Florence stepped out behind the cabin. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and close, and the smell of sap hung in the air as the pines warmed in the night wind. She didn't hear Owen approach until he was beside her. I used to come out here after my father passed, he said. Didn't know what else to do with myself. She turned toward him. What was he like? Strict, fair. He never said the word proud, but he built things solid and expected the same. Spoke with his hands more than his mouth. Sounds like someone I know. He looked down, then back toward the hills. He'd have liked you. She folded her arms across her chest. You think so? I know so. They stood together on the damp earth, the hush of the wind the only sound between them. I never told you what happened to Phoebe's father, she said after a long pause. You don't have to. I want to. He waited, gaze steady. He was a wheelwright, good with his hands, not so good with patience. When she was 2, he caught fever. I sat with him 3 days straight. By the 4th, he was gone. Owen didn't speak, but the shift in his shoulders said he heard every word. I buried him with a bit of cloth I'd embroidered for our wedding. We didn't have much, but it felt wrong to send him without something made by hand. You ever talked to him since? Sometimes, she said. When the wind's just right. The breeze stirred the edge of her sleeve. She looked up. I don't feel alone anymore, she said. Because you're not. She reached for his hand. And you. I was a man made of stone for a long time, but stone breaks. I just didn't know it could break open. She leaned into him, their shadows long in the moonlight. No promises were spoken, no vows exchanged. But in the stillness, something old and quiet settled between them, something built not of longing but of choice. Inside, the fire burned low. The cabin, once a place of retreat, now held warmth not just in its hearth but in its walls. And out beneath the stars, 2 people who had lost more than they ever said aloud stood side by side, having found not only each other, but the shape of a life worth tending. The days stretched longer now, light spilling across the valley by the time Florence stirred in the morning. On the first truly warm afternoon of May, she and Owen stood at the edge of the new room's frame, the scent of sawdust and sap still clinging to the air between them. The walls were up, roof not yet shingled, but the bones were there sturdy and square, with space enough for Phoebe's own bed and a small shelf already built into one corner. Florence ran her fingertips along the window ledge, smoothing a knot in the wood. "She won't believe this is hers," she said. "She'll believe it when she fills it with her drawings," Owen replied, wiping his palms on his trousers. Florence turned to him. "You've done more for her in 3 months than anyone since her father passed." Owen tilted his head slightly. "I could say the same for the both of you. I didn't know what it meant to keep something alive until you showed up." She didn't answer, only stepped forward and laid her hand flat against his chest. He covered it with his own, warm and steady. That evening, while Phoebe colored beneath the porch eaves, Florence trimmed the edge from a length of muslin she'd dyed with onion skins. The pale gold fabric would serve as curtains for the new room. Owen sat on the porch steps, whittling a small horse from a block of pine. His fingers moved slow, sure, the blade flicking off curls of wood that scattered at his boots. "She asked if you'd teach her," Florence said, threading her needle. "Said you make the wood talk." "She did," Florence nodded, not looking up. "She says it's soft, like she's afraid you'll say no." He didn't speak for a moment. "Then, if she's willing to listen, I'll teach her anything I know." The wind shifted, carrying the first hint of lilac from the grove near the stream. Florence paused, the needle half drawn. "Do you ever think about marrying again?" she asked. Owen looked at her, his knife still in his hand. "I do," her eyes met his. "Would you?" "I would, but only if it's for building a life, not just patching holes." She set her sewing aside and stepped down to meet him. "That's all I'm trying to do, build something that doesn't fall apart." Owen stood, the carving forgotten on the step. He took her hands in both of his. "Then marry me," he said. "Not for convenience, not because we've made it work this far, but because I can't imagine another season without you beside me." She didn't hesitate. "Yes." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time since her life turned to ash, she felt everything settle into place. They married on a Sunday in late June, beneath the white pines behind the cabin. Florence wore a dress she'd sewn from soft gray linen, and Owen shaved for the first time in weeks. Phoebe carried a small basket filled with wildflowers she'd picked herself, mostly white yarrow and early daisies, and stood between them as they spoke their vows before the traveling preacher from Benton. There were no guests, no music, no feast. Just the three of them, the wind, and the land that had watched them grow into a family. That night, after the sun disappeared behind the western ridge and Phoebe had fallen asleep curled in her new bed, Florence and Owen sat together on the porch, their shoulders touching. "Do you ever miss what came before?" she asked. Owen watched the fireflies rise from the grass like sparks. "Sometimes, but it doesn't weigh me down anymore." Florence leaned her head against his arm. "I used to think I'd always be running from something. Now I'm not running at all." "You're home," he said. She smiled. "We both are. Years passed, quiet and full." The garden grew each spring, and Owen added a root cellar and a lean-to for the mule. Florence's stitching found its way into homes across the valley: aprons, baby gowns, mended cuffs sent back with a sprig of sage tucked inside. Phoebe learned to carve, then to read, then to write her own name in looping letters that covered the back wall of the shed before they caught her at it. They never left the valley, never needed to. Each winter, Florence tucked extra quilts around the beds, and Owen read aloud from the almanac by lantern light. Each summer, Phoebe ran barefoot through the grass, her laughter echoing down the hill. And every night, when the fire had burned low and the wind settled into the trees, Florence reached for Owen's hand in the dark, and he held it like he always had, firm, warm, without question. They grew older together, lines softening around their eyes, hair silvering. But the shape of their love never changed. It lived in small things: a steaming bowl set on the table, the sound of boots waiting by the door, the feel of familiar hands brushing past one another in the morning. They had built something that never cracked, not once. And every morning, when the sun rose over the pines, they rose with it together.